Chuck Norris was in the first-class queue at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport, which was a sharp contrast to the rushed, wealthy travelers surrounding him. One man, Bradford Sterling, observed him with blatant contempt, his haughtiness nearly evaporating from him. Before we get started, let us know where you're checking in from if you like stories like these. What occurred next would leave everyone on that flight completely startled and permanently change one man's view on life. Subscribe to the channel so that we can share another amazing tale with you tomorrow. Texas, Fort Amid, the commotion at Worth International, which included a cacophony of rushing feet, ringing phones, and the rumbling of luggage. A man named Chuck Norris stood composedly in the first-class line. He was wearing a well-worn denim jacket, a simple t-shirt, and cozy pants. There was nothing particularly striking about him, which may have contributed to his initial lack of attention, but anyone who looked at him again could see something unusual. His boots appeared to have traveled many miles. He seemed like a man not only because of his clothes, but also because of the quiet intensity he exuded. While everyone else seemed anxious and hurried, he remained unaffected by the frenetic energy surrounding him. Chuck seemed unfazed by the looks or the stark contrast between himself and the other passengers. Bradford Sterling was standing in the queue directly behind him. He stayed calm and studied the surroundings with an almost meditative focus. Bradford was everything Chuck wasn't. He wore a custom suit, shining shoes, and a gaudy gold watch. His eyes moved impatiently across the line, and when they came to rest on Chuck, he sneered. First Class H. Bradford sneered with a patronizing grin. Chuck turned his head and looked at him, his expression unreadable, and all he said was, "The world is full of surprises." Bradford scowled because he had anticipated a stronger response that would support his first assessment. Chuck, however, said nothing, as though the remark had no effect, and Bradford, unable to let it go, pushed harder. "No offense intended, but you don't exactly look like the kind of guy who flies first class." He laughed quietly. "It's not often you see someone so, laid back up here." The boarding announcement was made. The first-class line started to move, and Chuck and Bradford followed their tickets in hand without exchanging any more words. When they eventually entered the plane, the unexpected happened. Bradford double-checked his ticket and looked up to see Chuck settling into the seat right next to his. "Are you kidding me?" Bradford, as expected, walked with stiff, self-important strides, while Chuck continued to move at his own even pace, unaffected by the noise around him. Bradford said, shaking his head in shock, and grudgingly sat down next to Chuck. Chuck laughed, sarcastically. "Of all the places that could be here, Chuck just looked at me with that same calm, steady gaze and gave me a slight nod that looks like we're traveling together," before stating bluntly. As the other passengers boarded, Bradford chose to strike up a conversation, but not out of any friendly sentiment, asking in an aloof tone, "What do you do for a living?" As if he already knew the answer but needed to hear it. Bradford crossed his arms to hide his annoyance, since it wasn't just sitting next to Chuck that bothered him, but the realization that the man he had just so openly mocked was now sharing the same exclusive space. Chuck, who was putting his suitcase under the seat, looked up and replied, "I teach self-reliance." Bradford arched his brow and grinned, saying, "Oh, I see, a motivational speaker." Chuck gave a slight shake of his head and a tiny smile appeared on his lips. Bradford joked about it. "It's always fascinating how people look for their position. You know, some areas aren't for everyone, and first class is one of them." Chuck calmly watched him. "I think that everyone has a place, and sometimes that place is right where they are at that moment." Although it's a great sentiment, Bradford laughed, but this isn't a feel-good film. Real life is like this. Chuck just turned and gazed out the window, but Bradford wasn't done. Bradford remarked, "You might be sitting here right now, but there are some things that money just can't buy, and some places will just never truly belong to certain people." Chuck looked to Bradford without saying anything, but his unwavering glance screamed louder than words ever could. Bradford realized his provocation was pointless and sat back in his chair. Wearing a smug expression, he appeared to be in control even though he was unaware of what was about to happen. And Bradford thought he was in control. But Chuck's reserved manner concealed something he was unable to see. Every minute that went by, their relationship was developing into something much more intricate than simple banter with the aircraft. Now that Airborne was underway, the in-flight service started, and a flight attendant went through first class passing out drinks. "A glass of your finest champagne, please." Bradford made sure he was recognized. He said with a haughty look that something that matched the exclusivity of this seat was needed. The flight attendant, used to such requests, nodded politely. When Chuck's turn came, he asked for only water. "Thank you." Bradford couldn't help but remark. He smirked at Chuck and questioned, half laughing, "Surely you're not going to waste the experience of flying first class with water?" When he looked at him, with a smile on his face, Chuck accepted the water bottle from the attendant. Sometimes, simplicity is plenty. Bradford narrowed his eyes, which I guess is effective for people who are content with less because not everyone is made to have the best. Other passengers noticed Bradford's increasingly harsh behavior, but Chuck sipped a drink without reacting. Seeing how indifferent Chuck seemed, no one stepped in. Though perhaps what's best is different for everyone. Chuck stated quietly. Unhappy, Bradford took a deep breath and tried his best to maintain control over their contact. Perhaps individuals who say such things have never understood what really matters. Certain things are simply out of grasp for some people. Serving another passenger, the flight attendant glanced in their direction, prepared to step in if necessary, but she noticed that Chuck had it covered. Perhaps Chuck whispered something quietly as she turned back to the window. But Bradford wasn't giving up. He was determined to get a response from Chuck, even though he was beginning to realize that it wouldn't be simple. Bradford felt like he was winning the battle, but his haughtiness was making people uncomfortable, while Chuck stayed composed. When the flight attendant returned to where Bradford and Chuck were while she served beverages, Bradford was about to receive a reality check that would permanently alter his outlook on life. Bradford made the decision to keep up or even intensify his series of provocations. "You know, life is like flying first class," he said, gesturing with his champagne glass. "You work hard, you earn your spot, and then you get to appreciate it. But some people, well, they just appear to be here because of pure luck." Chuck put his water bottle on the tray table and turned to face Bradford. His eyes were calm, but there was a steely undertone. "Whether it's luck or hard work, we all end up in the same place when we land," Chuck said. The passengers, who had been attempting to look uninterested, started to pay attention after noticing the growing tension. Bradford tried to conceal the fact that he was getting annoyed by Chuck's quiet assurance by smiling. "I wouldn't say so, though, as some of us are just more advanced than others, and not everyone genuinely appreciates the importance of being here. I think the value of being here isn't about what you possess, but about how you treat others," Chuck said, leaning forward a little. He waved around the cabin. A few passengers gave faint nods as the words lingered in the air. Bradford tried his best to shrug it off as others gave him disapproving glances, but his uneasiness was starting to show. "That's great coming from you, a top-notch self-help expert. Guru, perhaps you ought to start offering inspirational in his remarks." Chuck looked away, smiling simply, and ended the talk quietly and calmly. The way they interacted spoke, louder than words, and the passengers began to react. Some were whispering among themselves, while others were staring at Bradford with disapproving expressions on their faces. A few passengers, a few rows back, appeared to recognize Chuck, but they said nothing and just watched the scene play out. Bradford, meanwhile, became aware that he was being watched, and not in a positive way. His posture had changed from one of confidence to one of trying to look as though he was still in control. But it wasn't working. Bradford believed he was winning the argument, but it was obvious from the other passengers' reactions that it wasn't true. He was going to learn something that would cause him to re-evaluate his beliefs about respect, power, and status, as the flight attendant returned to retrieve the empty glasses. Bradford chose to escalate the situation, and you know what's always humorous? Bradford went on to say that someone with nothing valuable constantly talks about simplicity and humility. At one point, he observed that Chuck leaned forward a little and fixed Bradford with him. The people who talk the most about what they have are usually the ones who feel the most empty inside, in my experience. The words rang true for a brief moment, and Bradford seemed stunned, struggling to reply. He opened his mouth, but the right words didn't come out. The other passengers began to exchange looks, impressed by Chuck's handling of the situation, and they didn't mean any offense. Although Chuck leaned back in his seat, Bradford said, "Trying to recover, but the world is a competition. If you don't show what you have, people will just ignore you. I believe that true success doesn't require shouting about, it speaks for itself." The words appeared to have an effect on the passengers, as some of them subtly nodded. Bradford, who obviously wasn't used to being questioned in this manner, received unflattering looks from others. The first-class cabin was now packed with a lot of passengers watching Chuck and Bradford's encounter. An older man sitting nearby watched the event with a visibly disgusted expression on his face. Bradford tried to hide his irritation by pointing out the stairs, but instead of giving up, he made another snide remark. Cheap philosophy may sound nice, but the real world isn't like that. Chuck looked at him with the same serene expression. But people make up the real world, and how you treat other people ultimately says more about you than anything else. Looking about, Bradford could see that the passengers were no longer paying attention to him, and that some of them were whispering, which made him very uneasy. Others just gave him disapproving looks on their faces, though he believed he was in control. Bradford was beginning to realize that his strategy of controlling the conversation was failing. Chuck's remarks were having a significant effect on the passengers, and possibly even on him. The tension in the cabin was evident, and Bradford crossed his arms to conceal the fact that he was becoming agitated. Chuck, though, seemed unfazed. He turned to face Bradford and broke the quiet with a soothing voice that you are familiar with. While I acknowledge that competition can be fierce, I've discovered that sometimes the urge to constantly prove oneself stems from a deeper sense of insecurity. Uncertain if that was a challenge or an attempt to engage in conversation, Bradford raised his eyebrows, indicating inner insecurity. He laughed and said, "I don't know where you got that idea, because you couldn't be more wrong." Chuck grinned, a little perhaps, but I've known a lot of people who believed that success was all about what other people saw, and that deep down they were just trying to fill a void. When the words hit Bradford, he was silently tinkering with his watch, as though he was lost in thought. But he quickly recovered his tone, defensive. "That's not me. I've worked hard for everything I've got, and I don't need anyone to tell me how to live." Chuck remained composed and took his time before replying, glancing at Bradford. "I'm not saying you didn't put in a lot of effort, but sometimes we get so caught up in the idea of flaunting what we have that we forget to ask ourselves, who are you without all of this?" Bradford's lips tightened as the question seemed to strike a chord with him, but he wasn't prepared to acknowledge that it bothered him. "Who are we?" he said cynically. "We are what we have built. Without that, we are nothing." "I don't think so," Chuck said, looking him in the eye. "After all, our actions toward others define us more than our material possessions, and the things we display to the outside world ultimately signify far less than the things we carry within." Bradford appeared to be having difficulty keeping his cool, which is simple to say, as he pointed to his chest. His remarks echoed throughout the cabin, and several of the passengers nodded. Bradford nearly sprang from his chair. "You don't know anything about me. You don't know what I've had to do to get to this point," Chuck said coolly. "That's correct. I don't need to know your background, but I do know that occasionally people need to brag about their accomplishments because they're attempting to conceal something, insecurity and fear loneliness. The words were really powerful. Bradford halted and tightened his fists, appearing to be on the verge of exploding. His face was flushed with fury and probably shame. When Bradford finally lost control, he stood up and knocked his empty champagne glass to the ground. "You think you are better than me?" he yelled, grabbing everyone's attention. "You sit there with your little phrases as if you know everything about life, but you know nothing about living in the real world." The cabin fell silent in shock at Bradford's outburst, and the flight attendant arrived to try to calm things down. "I don't think I'm better than you," Chuck stated quietly, "but sometimes we need to pause and think about what is really important. You don't need to prove yourself to anyone, Bradford." Chuck stayed sitting and watched Bradford carefully. The words struck Bradford hard, and he was breathing heavily, but something in Chuck's voice made him sit back down. He looked away, defeated, and Bradford was silent. Chuck's words were replaying in his head, and he had never felt so exposed or vulnerable in front of so many people. But he was still unaware that the worst was still to come. The remainder of the flight was quieter after the confrontation, and Bradford remained in his seat, making it obvious that he was extremely uneasy. Chuck, on the other hand, appeared to be as at ease as ever, as though nothing had happened. A little while later, the flight attendant smiled as she approached Chuck. The passengers in the cabin were drawn to her voice. "The pilot, Mr. Norris, has asked me to offer you his best wishes and to inform you that your connection flight in Atlanta is scheduled to go well." Within the cabin, the name Norris reverberated among the passengers who had been listening in silence, opened their eyes, and heard a whisper in the cabin. At that point, Bradford froze Norris. He muttered something that seemed nearly unbelievable. Despite the hubbub, Chuck nodded to the flight attendant before thanking her and turning to face Bradford, who was staring at him as if he had just seen a ghost. Something wasn't right. "Bradford." Chuck smiled slightly as he cast him. He seemed completely puzzled as Bradford opened his lips, but was unable to speak. He glanced about and saw that the other passengers were staring at him, some curiously and others clearly disapproving. Evidently uneasy, Bradford sagged back in his chair and muttered to himself, trying to defend his behavior. "When you didn't identify yourself," he stammered, "so I didn't know who you were." It wasn't necessary for Chuck to identify himself with "my name," because he spoke calmly, but with a forceful tone. Chuck sighed somewhat as Bradford remained silent before attempting to defend himself. "Look, I didn't mean to insult you. I simply didn't know who I was speaking to. Bradford, everything you have stated remains unchanged simply because you now know my identity. The truth is determined by how you choose to treat other people, not by the speaker." The statements rendered Bradford speechless. He turned to face Chuck, then to the other passengers, who were now all staring at him. He felt utterly humiliated, and Chuck broke the stillness in the cabin by choosing to stop the conversation. "Bradford, life is tough. People disparaging others in order to enhance their own appearance is the last thing we need." With a long nod, Bradford appeared to finally consider what he had done. The rest of the flight was quiet as Chuck leaned back in his chair, effectively ending the conversation. Bradford, meanwhile, sat still and stared at his hands, repeating everything he had said. Bradford wasn't just confronted by Chuck. He was also confronted by the truth, and he started to realize that, despite his attempts to minimize others, he had disclosed much more about himself than he had meant to. As the minutes went by, Bradford, who had appeared to own the cabin at the beginning of the trip, looked noticeably uncomfortable. He avoided making eye contact with Chuck and the other passengers, and the haughtiness he had shown at the beginning had given way to shame. Bradford couldn't stop thinking about what Chuck had said, how many times he had made snap judgments about people without ever attempting to get to know them. Perhaps he was right, he muttered to himself, unaware that he had glanced over at Chuck. who was reading a book calmly as if nothing had happened, which only made the situation worse. Chuck had allowed his actions to speak for themselves as the jet started to descend without trying to impress anyone. Bradford. He turned to Chuck, after finally finding the confidence to speak, his eyes still down. "I need to apologize," he said, "not for what I said because of who you are, but rather because I was conceited and behaved foolishly." Chuck looked at him calmly as ever and waited a moment before answering, "Thank you for the apology, but more than that, I hope you will learn from this." Bradford nodded, realizing that the words were an opportunity for Chuck to change, adding, "Sometimes the things we look for the most in the world we find the least within ourselves. I hope you find what truly matters to you." Bradford remained silent, but Chuck's words stayed with him because he knew that this moment could potentially change him. After they disembarked, Bradford stood in the terminal watching Chuck walk away when he noticed some fans approaching him to take pictures and greet him. Chuck greeted everyone with a genuine smile without any arrogance. It was evident that his kindness and simplicity came naturally to him. Bradford examined his own hands, knowing he had to make some adjustments. Chuck's remarks stuck in his head as a reminder that a person's actual value is based on how they treat other people, not on their position. In the end, we are all defined by the decisions we make. Are we living to attempt to impress others, or to just become better people? Chuck vanished and emerged into the crowd, and Bradford experienced a new emotion. Perhaps the meeting was not a coincidence. Perhaps it was an opportunity to start afresh. Chuck gives us a clear message with his remarks. Accurate. The next time you find yourself in a situation where you are passing judgment or in a conflict, keep in mind that respect and humility never go out of style, and that perhaps the change you wish to see in the world must begin with you. If you enjoyed this story, we have a lot more stories that will touch your heart. Click the screen to explore other stories of hope. Success is not based on what you achieve or what you show off. Rather, it is about the positive impact that you have on the world and the people around you. Tenacity and compassion